Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this edition to the Americas Desk, hosted by Global Americans in partnership with Florida International University. I am Diego Area, President and CEO of Global Americans. And over the past several days, different leaders from Latin American countries have convened in Miami, Doral, for the Shield of the Americas Summit, to launch what the administration has been calling America's Counter-Cartel Coalition. 17 countries signed a joint declaration committed to deepening intelligence sharing, maritime interdiction, joint security operations targeting cartel trafficking routes across the Caribbean and the Pacific. The goal was not only to produce consensus, definitely that was not the goal, but to build operational cooperation with like-minded countries in the region. For many, many years, the United States had been approaching regional integration through large hemispheric forums, like the Organization of American States, the Summits of the Americas. We were having that conversation, Brian. But this time, rather than trying to coordinate the entire hemisphere, Washington appears to be experimenting with a smaller coalition of like-minded countries to what some experts are calling now minilateralism in Latin America. In other words, leaders from Bolivia, Costa Rica, Panama, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, and Argentina were present, but also very important countries, the largest economies in Latin America, didn't attend. Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico weren't present. On the other hand, this has definitely a domestic lens. Former Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem was appointed special envoy for the initiative. That also signals that this is not only a foreign policy matter. This definitely has domestic implications, I would say specifically on migration enforcement and border security. And on top of that, while all this is unfolding, the world is just changing dramatically. We were just having a conversation about that as well. First, China's economic footprint in the region has critically increased in the past 2 decades, is the second largest trade partner of Latin America and the main trade partner for the majority of South American countries. And at the same time, global markets have been reacting to the US-Israeli war with Iran. Only yesterday, after President Trump announced that the conflict had effectively come to an end, oil prices fell back below $100 per barrel. But what makes this SHIELD initiative particularly interesting is that many of the countries that attended are middle-income economies from the region, economies that are not global superpowers, but that together shape regional supply chains, migration dynamics, and security cooperation. The real question is whether this initiative, like SHIELD, marked the beginning of a new model of hemispheric cooperation, one where middle-income countries play a decisive role in shaping regional security and geopolitical alignment. To answer these questions, we have a tremendous panel. First, I want to introduce Cristina Rosales, Managing Director of Kairos Public Affairs. Cristina brings extensive experience in strategic communications and public affairs related to Latin American markets, corporate engagement, and government relations across the region. She works and advises several of the president's ministers that travel to Miami as part of the SHIELD Summit, to not say all of them, okay? Cristina, my first question to you. From the point of view of these governments that you advise and businesses across the region, does participation in the SHIELD creates a real upside, or does it have political costs domestically?
Well, first of all, thank you, Diego, for having us here. This great panel, a great opportunity to talk right after what was a very busy weekend in Miami. I think the president actually just got back to Washington yesterday, so it was a purely Doral Miami weekend for a lot of us. To your question, I certainly think that it was a strategic opportunity for a lot of the governments that participated this weekend at the Shield of America Summit. Certainly, it was a translation, if I may say this, of the national security strategy that came out of Washington, the Monroe Doctrine that in fact was mentioned, really an opportunity to translate that in practice with like-minded partners, like-minded governments that joined the initiative this weekend. I certainly also, in my perspective, do see a bit of a balance that needs to be handled also domestically for a lot of these governments that certainly joined the initiative to fight some of the issues that are concerning most of the region, whether it's transnational crime, stopping the migration flows, cybersecurity issues. And so it is both a mix of having upward in a fight in this with Washington, but at the same time having to pragmatically handle these issues in a way that also deliver greater results and greater benefits at home. Not everything is security for the region, and I think we need to recognize that. I think, if I may say, one of the aspects that maybe we missed from the conference, from the summit, was having a greater commitment with the region that goes past security. So looking certainly at the economic footprint, at the investment footprint, and expanding into those specific issues that could greater fight some of those geopolitical issues that we see, for example, vis-a-vis China. So I think that's really how I see it from this weekend.
So maybe this is also a kind of ideological dilemma. I would say, in contrast with other administrations, this administration is prioritizing security over everything else. Whereas other administrations the approach would be combating the root causes of migration, of violence through economic prosperity, etc. So we'll have to see how this unfolds. Eric Martin, journalist from Bloomberg News, covering foreign policy all over the world. Eric, you were in Doral during the weekend. Poor you. What are your key takeaways of the Shield Summit?
Well, Diego, it was really interesting. I mean, as Christina was saying, it was very important from a security perspective, I think. I think it's important that that this summit did indeed go forward in terms of we were on Saturday marking 2 weeks, 1 week since the strike in Iran. It feels like 2 weeks or more, this new reality of the war. But I think it was important that the summit went forward and that it happened. It showed an effort of attention on the region and the Western Hemisphere from the administration, in spite of everything else going on in the world. But the war certainly hung over and cast a shadow over the summit. Originally, the president had been, my reporting from people familiar with the planning was that the president originally was planning to have mini bilateral meetings of at least 4 minutes with every president. In the end, that got shortened to a handshake and greeting. So that was essentially an average of about 1 minute with each president. And there was time for bilateral meetings among cabinet officials and the presidents. But I think that the delegations coming to Doral had been hoping for a bit more time and attention. And this is a continuation of a plot line that we see often experienced in the Western Hemisphere, of intention from administrations to work more on with the hemisphere, focus more, but then global events, these kinds of hot wars, whether it be Ukraine or Gaza or now Iran, and those taking a lot of attention. It's very hard for an administration in Washington to both focus on the hemisphere, where there are these security threats from cartels, and in this administration in particular, an intention to treat them as foreign terrorist organizations, as Stephen Miller said earlier last week at this same event, that they are, from the administration's perspective, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda of the hemisphere, but at the same time having to deal with all of these other pressing concerns globally. And as Christina mentioned, also just like-minded countries, the fact that you didn't have Mexico or Brazil represented there, countries that, and then Colombia as well, when you talk about security. So, but just between the three of them, countries that represent upwards of 60% of the population and the GDP of the region, those are, and figuring out a way to bring them in is going to be, I think, an ongoing challenge, whether that is something that's addressed bilaterally or in this kind of multilateral way under this new America's Shield initiative and anti-cartel dialogue?
Thank you, Eric. You're raising something very important. That is in the middle of all this chaos, global chaos that is happening. Oil prices 120 yesterday, something around those lines. The fact that still in this context, President Trump has decided to maintain the meeting, keep the meeting, to keep the momentum, I think is an important signal. I don't think, though, that this is just out of love, right? And I would like to bring my colleague Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy at FIU. Brian has spent many years analyzing security cooperation, defense policy, and strategic competition. And that's what brings me to this conversation, Brian. Do you think this engagement, renewed engagement with the region, is out of love, or do you think it's really about geopolitics of energy, supply chains, Iran, China?
First, Diego, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here and with esteemed colleagues who I've had the opportunity to benefit from their work respectively, and great job in terms of the leadership that you've been doing at Global Americans. So I want to say it's both. I mean, I have a belief that certainly Washington loves the hemisphere. I mean, the hemisphere, and arguably, the U.S. has been committed in the hemisphere, even if other fires around the world have sort of taken the attention away from the Oval Office. I think the United States has long maintained a persistent engagement. And even if that's not U.S. government, it's civil society, it's private sector engagement, it's a whole host of engagement that happens below the state. And so I think this renewed, at least commitment from USG in the national security strategy to focus on the Western Hemisphere is largely sort of centered in this idea that the United States has to have dominance in this hemisphere first and foremost, right? In a broader geopolitical, global, competitive landscape, and we can debate whether or not we're in a bipolar or multipolar landscape, but certainly the United States has to have dominance in this hemisphere first and foremost. And so I think this pivot to a national security strategy that looks very intentionally at the Western Hemisphere is in part out of love, but in part out of the geostrategic realities of today's international landscape. And I think that, again, this is the U.S. asserting dominance in this hemisphere first in terms of its ability to influence policy. And I think in that context, there's absolutely an undertone of competitive or strategic competition with China, particularly. Of course, there are others, Iran and Russia, as you mentioned. But I think China's the one that really keeps people up at night in the White House and in State Department and in Department of War, in terms of the incredible persistence that China has maintained over the last 20, 25 years in terms of growing its economic footprint, its political footprint, its security footprint, technological footprint, space footprint across the hemisphere. And the U.S. is now trying to reconcile with how do we push back against that. And I think that's the strategic context, often referred to as this kind of reinvigorated Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine. But if you peel all that back, it's really about strategic denial in this hemisphere. And so I think that the summit itself and this sort of pivot towards, first looking at like-minded countries is about sort of shoring up that support for that undertone of strategic competition. And then nesting it in things that are important for the United States. The U.S. has been unapologetic about pursuing its interests, right? That's been Washington's position. This is an America First agenda. And President Trump maintained a pretty persistent, tone of competing or combating illicit trafficking organizations throughout much of his platform. This was not, by the way, absent in his first term as well. I think what's different about this is that Washington is now signaling that it is okay for countries to use military force to target transnational criminal organizations. And by the way, we're willing to do the same, and we're willing to meet you and support you using our military. And sort of turning the region, almost into this wartime landscape that's focused on looking at criminal organizations as, violent terrorist organizations, which is often debated. But I think again that migration is also part of it. But one of the other things that was mentioned, I just want to, and I'll end here, that was really interesting about the president's speech, is he started talking by justifying Iran. And he seeded that in a few other times because, as you pointed out, there are serious macroeconomic realities or implications of the war. You mentioned the price of oil. I saw crude this morning, Brent crude up at 95. I think it had went up and gone down, but nonetheless, you're talking about a rapid escalation and constraint on global energy. And so that has real implications for the region. And so you have a president that's now saying, I want you to make significant investments using your militaries in combating. And by the way, the militaries can do border control and intelligence sharing, and I mean, we can unpack that too. But the president has to make that ask while also recognizing that there are some new macroeconomic realities that are ongoing right now for the region that the U.S. has to work its partners through. And this idea that the United States convene like-minded is, I don't think that replaces the broader multilateral landscape. I mean, again, as we were talking earlier, President Trump met Petro last month. He's invited Lula to Washington. U.S. supported with intelligence in the killing of El Mencho in Mexico. And so engagement is happening. But this was about bringing like-minded countries together, that they weren't going to have to fight and debate and argue about the right path. These were countries that are already on sort of line with U.S. approach. And it's about sort of marching orders, ceremonially signing a commitment to move forward, and then now it's about execution.
So is love geostrategic competition, global supply chains?
All of the above. It's all of the above, Diego.
And then there is also a huge domestic component. But before going there, I want to go to the region, Cristina. If Washington wants this coalition to hold, what are the kind of concrete kind of economic deliverables needs to give to the region so domestic audiences are kind of, satisfied with the partnership?
Yeah, I see that I'm wearing the econ hat in this dialogue, but I will fight for it. No, I think certainly, Diego, my argument here is that economic resiliency in the region goes hand in hand with security cooperation. There's no way to have one without the other. And I don't want to sound like the bad guy or, obviously part of this greater discussion, but I really do think that one thing that was a missed opportunity was to have a very concrete, like-minded security just like we did with the Security Cooperation Agreement, the ACCC, to have a version of the ACCC, but focus on economic integration and economic investment in the region. I really think that that's also what a lot of the countries that I work with, that I advise, were hoping to see as part of the summit, not necessarily in Doral, but as a continuation of the conversation that happened or that will happen after Doral. I don't think that this administration has yet signal that. So I think that is certainly a concern for the region. They do want to see greater economic commitment coming out of Washington, whether that is, as I mentioned, from an investment framework, from a nearshoring perspective, whether that is from a critical mineral standpoint. I think there are quite a few opportunities where Washington could really work with the region in building what could potentially be, in my view, maybe a counter to BRI. So how can we have a Washington and LATAM, version of Belt and Road Initiative where we are really putting that forward and countering what China is doing in the region? So that's at least my version of how I think a lot of the like-minded countries that participated in the summit would like to see greater economic integration going forward after Doral.
Thank you, Cristina. Something that comes to mind when listening to you is Trump's approach to Latin America. It has been mainly binational, right? On economic terms. So I am going to reset this framework and let's negotiate, right? Individually, bilaterally. But now it seems that this, for Latin America specifically, the security approach is minilateral, right? With these middle-income, like-minded countries, whereas with Mexico is again more bilateral. So it's kind of a hybrid between the two. Something also that I could kind of interpret from these actions is beyond the ideological component of security first, and like thinking through that lens, security first and then economic prosperity. You need to have a hemisphere without cartels that are controlling governments, that are embedded in the economy, in order to then deploy the U.S. private sector in the region. I'm not affirming anything. I'm just trying to food for thought.
I just wanted to add to that. I think to the question that you posed, I think one of the important aspects is that yes, we have to handle transnational crime. Yes, we have a security issue in the region, but we also need to find greater ways to bring public and private together. So we need to have public-private sector partnerships going forward in the region. We need to incorporate the private sector in these discussions. And I'll end this and by saying this, that a lot of the infrastructure in the region is owned by the private sector, whether it's telecommunications, ports, everything that has a security angle in the region has a private sector presence or ownership. So it's impossible to commit to fighting a lot of these security issues without having the private sector involved.
And Brian would argue that that's the main difference between China and the U.S. China and and its private sector are like completely aligned, but with the U.S. private sector, you need to convince shareholders, boards, etc. I want to come back to the U.S. I want you, Eric, to help us understand the domestic component of all this. Kristi Noem appointed as the appointment in signaling who inside the administration is driving this effort and what are the broader components of this. The national security team, the diplomatic apparatus, or the domestic enforcement side of the White House?
Sure. Well, from my reporting has been that this has been something that, to this point, has been very much driven by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We know about his personal interest and his investment and attention to issues in the Western Hemisphere throughout his Senate career. And he was officially co-chairing the part of the dialogue with I can't recall if it was specifically the ACCC or the entire summit with former Secretary Noem. But certainly it's a new role for her. I mean, one that was not even contemplated or was certainly not shared publicly even a few days prior to the summit. This was something that was announced just I think 24, 48 hours prior. And so was her being kind of thrust into the center of things. There was a dialogue. It was presidents plus one advisor, along with the Secretary of State and USTR and others around midday on Saturday, of which actually in the public comments of that forum, former Secretary Noem was the one who spoke the most and really tried to introduce herself to any of the leaders present who did not yet know her, and said she would give them all of her personal cell phone numbers once the press left the room. So, but this was very much a last minute addition in terms of her role, and of course her role with DHS was more focused on security, deportations, immigration, these kinds of issues. She's visited a number of those countries in that role, but this new role within the State Department and as the envoy is something that she will I think adopt more broadly as time goes forward. To pivot back to something that Brian mentioned, particularly about China. Certainly that is China's role in the hemisphere was a topic that was in the air on Saturday. I mentioned I wanted to go back to the reason that the time that the President Trump had with the presidents for the region was shortened was because he went to Dover for the dignified transfer of the first American soldiers killed in the war in Iran. And certainly China has been for a long time the principal buyer of energy, of oil from Iran, but you also see China a big footprint, obviously, in Venezuela, tens of billions of dollars in recent years in lending to the Maduro administration in Maduro regime in Venezuela, as well as even places such as Chile, which has just elected its most conservative president in decades, and this issue of an undersea cable for which some Chilean officials have been sanctioned by the Trump administration, the future of that because of China's involvement there. But also when you look at other things, we haven't yet mentioned Cuba, but Cuba and the reporting in recent years of China taking over former Soviet spy bases in Cuba, Chinese purchasing of Venezuelan oil previously, Chinese supply of energy to Cuba. So China's role within the hemisphere, even inroads in Mexico in the last several years, certainly is something that the national security strategy would argue against. And this corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting the U.S. preeminence in the hemisphere in contrast to and in conflict with potentially any outside powers looking to assert their own power in the hemisphere. That is very much something, if not directly from a security standpoint and counter-narcotic standpoint, from fentanyl coming into Mexico from China, fentanyl precursors, then certainly in terms of the economic relationship, as Christina was discussing, and how that is dealt with, not only with all of the countries that were there on Saturday, but also with Mexico and this upcoming USMCA renegotiation, closing and slamming shut that back door for China to enter the U.S. in terms of the dumping of product, of raw materials, things like that, looms large. So I think that that's something that definitely hangs in the air as a context and a subtext for all of these kinds of meetings that we saw over the weekend.
Thank you for that, Eric. Brian, how much does the absence of the big three, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, would you say affect the effectiveness of this initiative? Do you think this smaller group of countries could effectively combat narco-trafficking and criminal networks in the region without the support of those three? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think their absence was largely ministerial, right? I don't think it was overwhelmingly significant, and I don't think that was the spirit of what the White House was trying to do. I think the White House was trying to pull its partners together, its true allies that it can, pen a commitment to, collectively and individually as nations, combat illicit trafficking organizations in the respective countries. And I do not think that means that Colombia, Brazil, or Mexico are not going to be engaged in this. I think that's going to happen more in bilateral context, right? And more importantly, I don't think it was it would have played well to Petro, Lula, and Sheinbaum's respective audiences if they came and participated in Trump's summit in Doral. And so I think to some degree it was a ministerial element that doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't extrapolate too much from it as meaning that they're not going to be engaged. I mean, they are. I mean, the fact that Mexico took the leap to kill Amencho and what happened afterwards is a testament to the fact that Sheinbaum may be moving more aggressively and again accepted U.S. support to some degree to help do that. So again, I look at it more ministerial. I think it played to both respective teams to not be in the room together for this. And more importantly, I don't think Washington was looking to make this a debate. They weren't looking to pull countries together to debate the way ahead. They were looking to pull countries together to say, this is what we're going to do. You're all online already. Let's move. And I think that was important. And one of the things I was going to say earlier to a comment you made is don't forget the importance of how that plays to the U.S. domestic audience. I mean, this is a major issue for the American people in terms of fentanyl. And so this idea that the president, brought all of these presidents together and signed this major agreement to combat drug trafficking, a handful of months before the midterm elections is also, I think, an important domestic consideration to think about in terms of how it plays domestically. So again, I don't read too much into the absence of those countries. And by the way, not all of the countries that the president brought to Doral or invited to Doral equally, are engaged in the kinds of, transnational criminal organizations. I mean, it's hard to compare what Ecuador's going through versus what Paraguay or Guyana might be going through. I mean, they all have very unique contexts in which they're combating, the organized crime. And again, I think this was a commitment that the United States was making to support those countries. Again, I think it was an affirmation to use military institutions, which has hotly been debated because of the region's history with military dictatorships, and so that's always been sort of contentious. This is Washington saying, we're not placing a value judgment on that anymore. We want you to engage, with the most capable institutions you have to engage this threat, and that we're also willing to do the same thing, which has also been very tense. I mean, the U.S. has not been, very active in terms of deploying kinetic military force in the Western Hemisphere. And so you have Maduro, and now you have Ecuador, and you're probably going to see more countries in which the U.S. military is going to deploy and use kinetic military force to combat transnational criminal organizations.
The game has changed, definitely. This is a different game geopolitically, domestically, regionally. So since some of these countries didn't attend last weekend, the summit, we decided to bring them here to Washington, D.C. So we have asked Luis Gilberto Murillo, former foreign minister of Colombia and current presidential candidate, to share his thoughts. He doesn't only come from a country that didn't participate, but he also comes from I would say, contrasting ideological perspective. Let's hear from him. Thank you, Jose.
I want to thank Global Americans and Florida International University for the opportunity to share the Colombian perspective following the Shield of the Americas Summit. One of the most important lessons from our region, and also for all discussion, is that security, migration, and development are deeply connected. Across the Americas, we are facing rising violence and migration pressure, but we must recognize that lasting solutions require addressing the root causes of these challenges. These challenges are reflected in inequality, lack of opportunity, and limited economic mobility. This is why promoting shared prosperity, investment, and economic opportunity must be central to our hemispheric strategy. Countries like Colombia believe that strengthening partnership across the region and across the Americas, particularly with the United States, will be essential to achieving this goal. The U.S.-Colombia relationship has long demonstrated how cooperation in security, development, and democratic institutions can create stability and opportunity for our citizens in the entire region. Looking forward, the Americans have an opportunity to deepen collaboration that combines security, cooperation, investment, development, and inclusive growth. By working together, we can bring a hemisphere that is more secure, more prosperous, and better prepared to address the challenges of migration and inequality. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Luis Gilberto. Luis Gilberto is also a member of the International Advisory Council of Global Americans. So he seems to be very aligned with your perspective, Cristina. Any reaction to this?
I don't know if you're telling me that I'm part of this political campaign. No. Although we did have also a busy weekend in Colombia in terms of election-wise, and then let's see how things also shape up in May. No, I think Diego, certainly, stepping also away from the, wearing my economic hat. I think obviously I made that argument there, but I do see this importance of having an inclusion of these specific countries. I know, Brian made his argument, and I agree. It's not necessarily that this is going to happen in a place like the Shield of the Americas conference, but I am concerned that, we might not have the return of a Summit of the Americas. We might not have any more spaces in a regional perspective where we will have an inclusion of all voices. I'm not saying that that is a need, but I think we here in Washington need to, as a cohesive group, really think about what space that could become. Is Shield of the Americas in the future, could it be a sort of a different space to include some of these countries? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these issues, whether it's organized crime coming out of Brazil, PCC, Comando Vermelho, whether it's out of Mexico, the Mexican cartels, whether it's out of Colombia, we have it's ongoing issue. These are the countries that are facing these issues. So it is very difficult to have like-minded countries with Washington talk about these issues and not include the countries where the problem is actually happening. So I really, that's certainly a concern that I do see going forward as to how do we translate and have this inclusion factor in a space like Shield of the Americas. And then lastly, I do hope that going forward, we do see a greater translation, or I would say the building of an initiative, just like ACCC, but really focused on investment, really focused on, bringing together the rest of the region from an economic standpoint. I don't want to say that what happened in maybe necessarily in the last administration with APEP is also the answer. So I know some folks have been messaging me indicating that I am a fan of APEP, but I do think that we do need to have a way to maybe build something similar, translated to what the reality is right now between this relationship between Washington and the region and the Down Road Doctrine.
Thank you, Christina. Any other reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll respond to this, but I do echo the concern. And again, I think there's a place for multilateralism, but I think this administration, and again, this isn't me, I think this administration sees multilateralism as strategic risk. I think it sees multilateral organizations as strategic risk, where it can't assert complete dominance to pursue its agenda. And I think that's fundamentally the challenge you're raising, which what that means is that's not a space for shared voices. That's a space for this is my interest and I'm pursuing it. And I think the White House has been pretty unapologetic about this, right? They've been unapologetic about saying we are pursuing an America First agenda. And so we're not looking to debate our interests. We're looking to pursue our interests. And so we don't want fora where we have to debate and make our case. This is our case. And so I think that's the spirit of what we're seeing. That doesn't mean that in the future multilateralism may not come back. I mean, I think there's, to your point, it's vital to bring those shared communities together, give those communities voice and sort of equity in how the region moves forward. But I just don't think this administration sees that at this particular juncture in terms of pursuing its interests. And I agree that the interconnectedness of all of these things, and I think one of the biggest fundamental challenges that the region's faced, and this is not just the region, I think there's a global phenomenon in terms of weak democratic institutions, right? So I mean, it's hard to get to socioeconomic reforms and prosperity when you have widespread corruption and you have weak institutions. I mean, the whole reason that Washington is asserting the use of the military is because law enforcement organizations at the municipal, provincial, and national level are corrupt and inept and completely incapable of dealing with this issue on their own. And so I think, what maybe, and again, I don't speak on behalf of the White House for sure, right? I'm an academic, but I get to say what I want. And I think what my interpretation of the White House is, combating transnational organized crime more than your prosperity is an important interest of ours. We also think that is a root cause for weak institutions and weak rule of law. And so if we can address the pervasiveness of criminal enterprises, then maybe that will get us to some of the, you mentioned root causes. So I think that's part of the maybe how I'm interpreting this White House moving towards this policy in the hemisphere. And again, I don't disagree. Those are all interconnected. But this White House says your prosperity, your socioeconomic inequality, that's an issue that you're going to have to deal with. We share the issue of transnational criminal organizations threatening our interests, migration, all of that. So we're gonna go there first, and that's where we're going to put our resources.
Eric.
Yeah, I think that Brian and Christina both make very good points, and Luis Gilberto as well, in terms of the one of the root causes of migration being the violence and the public insecurity in a number of these countries. I also agree with I think with Brian's point about multilateralism and the approach to multilateralism as far as the view from the administration. Although with the caveat that, of course, the U.S. this year in December will be hosting the G20 leaders, and so we'll be back in Doral, actually in the same spot for a much broader conversation, which, interestingly will include Brazil and Mexico. Of course, those leaders need to decide if they will attend, and sometimes, in particular, Mexican presidents in recent years have not attended the G20, but that gives another forum. Of course, the conversation at the G20 is much broader and much more global than specifically about the hemisphere, but there's something both that you gain in a conversation like the one over the weekend by having Mexico and Brazil, but there's also, I think there has been at times a risk and a complaint from others in the region that because these are countries of hundreds of millions of people and more than 1 trillion each in terms of GDP, that they can sometimes get a lot of the attention and crowd out other countries. So I think there is a place for dialogue among smaller economies that are not the top 2 or in the top 5, necessarily in the hemisphere. And one more point, which is that in terms of the ideology of all of this, while at the moment, and we saw a lot of the leaders who were at this summit have not had the opportunity before to meet in any capacity with President Trump or with U.S. cabinet level officials. I saw on Friday night, ran into Jose Antonio Cast, the president-elect of Chile, who will take office on Wednesday. Other leaders, Rodrigo Paz, who I interviewed on Sunday night, also recently took office. You will perhaps never have this region completely ideologically aligned. Claudia Sheinbaum's administration in Mexico is set to run her sexenio, will run through 2030. She both predated President Trump's return by several months and will be in office for a couple of years longer than him. So among the large economies, we'll see what happens in Brazil later this year, but it's just very hard, even when there are these so-called waves towards the left or the right in the hemisphere. I can't think of a moment when it's been entirely ideologically aligned. I don't see that that's going to happen in the mid to long term even. And so, as I think Brian said, the importance of having both these bilateral conversations with the big countries and getting the help of Mexico on these issues, but also being able to bring together an ideologically aligned group as you had this past weekend. I see the merit to both approaches and to attacking this from multiple angles.
You have a good point, and right now the stars are aligned in terms of the convergence, ideological convergence between these smaller, let's call them, middle-income economies with the U.S., and that gives them a huge strategic advantage. Thinking about countries like Paraguay, who are now I would say in a global scene, in the global conversation. 10 years ago, nobody knew where Paraguay was located, but now Trump has been flirting with President Peña, joking with him, meeting with him several times, recognizing the importance of Paraguay and that alignment. Thinking about how the stars are aligned, now we will hear from leaders that did attend the summit. President Rodrigo Chavez and Laura Fernandez, President-elect Laura Fernandez, share with us their perspectives of the post-summit. Thank you again, Joseba. Oh my
gosh. President of Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chavez, as well as the President-elect of Costa Rica, Laura Fernandez. So thank you very much.
Hay una historia de un país que los Estados Unidos consideren que no está trabajando bien con la inmigración, con el narcotráfico, con la seguridad.
Esta alianza con el gobierno americano para nosotros no es nueva. Más bien, el hecho de que estemos acá refuerza el compromiso que tenemos como país de seguir contribuyendo al logro de objetivos que son hemisféricos.
So this is again another example of the importance of the alignment here, and just want to open the conversation about, for example, what can happen with countries like Colombia that are facing presidential elections at the end of the year. Peru is having the first round of the presidential and senatorial and congressional elections next month. So do we think that this, depending on the electoral outcome in these elections, we can have an 18th or a 19th country in the Shield of the America Summit? Cristina?
Well, to echo what Eric mentioned earlier, I mean, I think we have a pretty busy electoral year in LATAM. We have in May, obviously, Colombia, Peru thereafter, Brazil in October, that's a big one. And then everybody comes together in the G20. So maybe by the time that we are back in Doral at the end of the year, we might have a completely different scenario in LATAM in terms of alignment. I mean, things can also go the other way, and things, Latin American elections are certainly not for the faint at heart, but I do think that down the road, depending on how things develop with Shield of the Americas and what that convening will look like going forward, it might be inclusive of some of these, bigger countries per se. I do think that certainly the challenge will still remain in a place like Mexico. At the end of the day, I think the discussion there will be very centered in the next couple of months on USMCA, what that economic structure will look like, and what does that also translate, and what does that mean from a security standpoint in terms of fighting transnational crime, fighting the cartels, and all of that. But I think we are for sure to see come December potentially a completely different region, and what that shape will take in terms of Shield of the Americas or G20 or any other convening. I think it certainly remains a big unknown, but let's see.
Yeah, I think that certainly Colombia has been one that's been fascinating to see the arc, if it can be called that, over the past 6 months. I mean, from President Petro, calling for U.S. troops to ignore orders in the park in New York City at the end of September, to sanctions, to a visa revocation, to then being permitted to come to Washington, to go to the White House, and expectations. I think Colombia is perhaps, Brazil certainly is well important, but Colombia the most important one to watch because of Cepeda and how he has behaved towards the U.S. and towards some of these issues earlier in his career. I think there was an expectation earlier last year from the U.S. administration that Colombia was ready to turn the page from the leftist government and the kind of ideology of President Petro. Certainly, Cepeda would not be a turning of the page from everything that we know from the campaign. Would possibly be a deepening of that rift with cooperation with the U.S. on some of these issues. So I think that one is extremely important to watch over the coming months.
Thank you for that, Brian. Something I like to add an ingredient to your answer is definitely Colombia. Plan Colombia, a lot of billions and from the U.S. For security. Brazil is always huge globally. But also we have, and in this context, we have been talking about China's presence in the region. So Peru's elections are happening next month. We have seen the consequences of the Chancay port in terms of the U.S. perception of what's the strategic implication of that. So why don't you talk a little bit about the implications of the outcomes of that elections in the context of the Shields of the Americas, etc.?
Yeah, one thing I'll say first is, I'm pretty sure the G20 is going to go. But I promise you somebody's in the White House right now asking whether or not they should cancel it, right? Again, the global context is going to be really tense. And depending on where the U.S. is after midterms, I would put nothing past the administration at this stage. We thought the Summit of the Americas was definitely a go, and that got pulled pretty quickly. So while I'm 90% sure, there's always that 10% that the G20 doesn't happen. Or at least, because remember, at one point, the U.S. wasn't going to participate, in Johannesburg. So, again, it's not unforeseeable. In this context, I think one of the areas in which the U.S. China competitive sort of fight is playing out is Peru is an incredible landscape for this, and I think the elections in Peru are going to be incredibly important in terms of where. Now, well, I say that, but here's the challenge. The challenge is that the U.S. is not in a position to push China out of the economic landscape in Latin America. We saw this with Milei. Milei said all of the right things during his election about pushing China out. And he took office, and what did he do? He said, we're going to push him out of this area, right? The security and right? But we can't do anything about the connective tissue that China has, with Argentina in the economic context. And I think the same is true in Peru with the Port of Shanghai, the massive amounts of mining projects that the Chinese have equity in, the fact that the Chinese have a dominant share of energy distribution in Lima, for example. It's just going to be really difficult to try to push the Chinese out. And so again, I think that no matter what the candidates say, whether they're leaning away or towards China, in the end, economically, it's going to be really hard to dislodge China from Peru. I think that's where the U.S. is looking to double down in the security context and deepen the relationship in the mill-to-mill landscape to build some resilience against China's ability to have total policy influence in places like Peru. And so I think that's probably the reality that we're going to see. No matter how this election shapes up, that would be my interpretation. I mean, you might have some economic losses, but then you got to replace it with something. And I'm not sure you said it earlier. Right, China's private sector, if you can call it a private sector, is an extension of its foreign policy. Right, the U.S. has to treat its private sector very differently. It has to inspire its private sector. It has to align its private sector, and it's not always good at doing that. Case in point, no one's rushing back in with billions of dollars to Venezuela to try to revitalize the Venezuelan energy sector. We know that's what's needed, and the president has said, please, he doesn't say please, but he did say go, and reinvest, and that's, I think, the spirit of legitimizing Delcy Rodriguez to some degree to try to give investors some degree of confidence, but not recognizing the National Assembly. I mean, it just makes it complicated. U.S. investors are not going to go unless they have some degree of certainties, and right now Washington can't make those.
Thank you, Brian. Cristina?
No, I did want to make a comment, Brian, and I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. Depending on the electoral result in Peru, I wonder if there is some sort of scenario where we can see a replica of, in a way, of what has been successful in Panama in terms of the pressure that the U.S. administration has exerted, and certainly the cooperation that has happened between Washington and the Panamanian government, and really how things have transformed. I think we have a great ambassador, Ambassador Cabrera, there, a good friend of mine, and certainly I think that what we've seen in the last couple of months in terms of changes at the ports, really how we've been able to, in a way, I don't want to say the word is not push out, but really reconfigure the scenario. And it's obviously very different in Peru, but I'm curious if we, depending on the result, whether we could see a similar scenario like that.
I think you're right, but that's in a very strategic context, and the strategic context is the Panama Canal, right? And I think that's what makes Peru unique, and Ambassador Cabrera is doing an amazing job at trying to confront sort of Chinese interests in the context of strategic U.S. national interests. I think you might see something like that in Peru. Ambassador Navarro's come in swinging. He's doing an amazing job. He wants to push Confucius Institutes out. I mean, he's looking to try to make his run at pushing the Chinese back or down in Peru in ways that doesn't necessarily have the overwhelming policy influence it's had for a long time. And so you might see some victories on strategic assets like ports, right? But again, the Chinese are so invasive across the broad spectrum of economy that it's going to be more strategic wins. Can we get the Chinese out of Peru's energy infrastructure? Do we focus on reducing the Port of Shanghai? So I mean, I think you're going to see some of that. I think that could be, that's the target. But in terms of the just degree of pervasiveness of Chinese economic activity, it's going to be really difficult to push it all.
Let me just say something. This is very illustrative of what's happening in Peru. Brian, you have been studying China's presence in the region and recognizing that the presence of China, the influence of China, is difficult to combat right now. It makes us we need to have a broader conversation about how economic engagement from the U.S., strategic economic engagement paired with security engagement and others can kind of combat that. I love your kind of your story on the Panama side, and I think that depending on what the outcome, I think Panamanian authorities should go to Peru and try to help the new government navigate these issues. Eric?
Yeah, I think that some very good points. A couple of things that I would add are that in Panama, the orientation of the government away from China, I think, predates the second Trump administration. The tax audits of the ports, Hutchison, and these issues were already active and were already in course. And so when I went with Secretary Rubio to Panama last February, his first trip abroad, as the first the first Secretary of State to make their first solo trip to Central America since Philander Knox in the early 20th century, which I think few of us remember or have as a
There, I was there.
Brian was there, so can tell us about it. But just they were pushing on an open door, I think, in Panama to a degree, and the challenge in Peru to a great extent are the domestic political considerations and the president of Peru, whoever the president becomes in a few months, being able to be there in a year from that point. It's been the almost unparalleled instability in Peru of presidential administrations in recent years is a significant challenge that I think hems in the options for whoever gets elected. And then finally, I think the point about the dependence of the region on China. China has fewer resources today than it did a decade ago in terms of the BRI, and it has its own its own lack of domestic demand and debt issues and other domestic economic challenges that make the kind of BRI lending, the kind of predatory lending that we saw in the past much harder to do, and we've seen that slow significantly in recent years, especially since the pandemic. But I think that underlying point about trade and that it's next to impossible for these countries to, given so many of them that have the majority of their economy resource dependent and resource and raw materials exports, they're not going to find a buyer with 1.4 billion people to quickly replace that demand. And so, it's I think a move in the right direction strategically from the U.S. The reauthorization of the DFC, changes that have been made there. But when you're talking about competing with China as an export market, that's something that structurally is next to impossible, if not impossible, to quickly substitute.
I just want to briefly reinforce that point. I think that's an excellent point about sort of where the trajectory of China's continued pervasiveness in the region is and whether or not that is a natural decline just as a result of the domestic context. And you mentioned it earlier, and I'm glad you did, because in the context of 21st century strategic denial, denying China really important resources is vital, right? We've been debating whether or not the mining in lithium, for example, is going to constrain U.S. growth in the future. Right now, China has a tremendous demand for oil. And there are 5 heavy crude producers in the world. U.S. and Saudi are 2 of them. Russia, Iran, Venezuela are the others. And so Venezuela is off the books for China. I think that the U.S. is looking to constrain Iranian oil to China. And then you got Russia that's left that's really going to be focused on supporting European. I mean, so that's so I think that's 21st century strategic denial, and that's probably going to hit China domestically really hard. And if I were the Chinese, I'd be really terrified about this broader global context that's brewing in 2026. And I think that domestic challenge that China's going to face is going to make its way into sort of a declining engagement in the region. So I think it may be serendipitous in terms of how it lines up.
So I want to make a couple of final points before we wrap this up. Thank you guys for an amazing conversation. First, Eric, on your point on the political viability to advance reforms in Peru, given the domestic politics, I think that's why it's so important, this election. And of course, we are looking at Iran, we're looking at oil prices soaring, we're looking at Venezuela, Shield Summit, etc. Peru is definitely not a priority. However, these elections are renewing Congress and Senate and also electing a new president. So it can mean a reconfiguration of the political forces within Peru. If I were an advisor to the National Security Council or to the U.S. government, I would be telling them, hey, invest some of your resources and your capacities to connect with the like-minded candidates and give them kind of an advantage of having a strong partner north, because those results will definitely shape the next decade in Peru's politics. That's one point I wanted to make. Another point, you mentioned APEC, and I tend to agree with you. But also, I'm thinking about another initiative that is not dead. It is in the refrigerator, I would say, led by Latin American and Caribbean countries, the Alliance for Development and Democracy. an alliance of like these were or are middle income economies united to kind of engage more assertively with the U.S. Maybe security can be combined with economic prosperity, maybe democratic institutions, because as you are saying, shareholders of U.S. companies definitely listen to the president, but they will go back to the Cristina Rosales of the world and ask, hey, would this country respect my investment? Would I be able to like extract my investment back, etc.? Those are questions that we need to continue discussing. So thank you again for coming and participating in this interesting conversation, and thank you all who joined virtually to this the America's Desk episode. Thank you.
Thank you.